Welcome to the first edition of the Populist Papers, where rogues and scoundrels gather unlimited motivation and vitality as we beseech the invisible chiefs to help guide you on a journey of subterranean enchantment where the elixir vitae awaits your indulgence.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to episode 5 of the Populist Papers. I am your host, Colin Kramer, and by law, because I'm a Jew, it is a requirement that I'm at least a little bit obsessed with money. So that's what today's show is going to be about. Also, you should know that this particular episode has secret sponsors, and we're actually going to be getting a call from one of them a little bit later. This is an episode I've been wanting to do for a while. There's a lot to it. I don't think a lot of people understand what happened with the Great Recession of 2008 and the bailouts. I don't even think people understand what happened in 1929. Both were Republican Great Depressions, caused by deregulation, bubble markets. Both have kind of helped bring us to the situation we're in today. Do you remember the game Monopoly? Lizzie Magie was a progressive, and she invented that game. It was originally called The Landlord, by the way, and Parker Brothers totally ripped her off and created their own Monopoly. That's a whole nother story, which I'll save for another time, maybe when I talk about my top 10 favorite board games of all time. But anyway, Lizzie Magie with The Landlord was making the point that in the end, with this system of predatory, laissez-faire capitalism, only one person can ever win. It's a monopoly, which is a lot like a monarchy. It gets very monotonous. And when one motherfucker ends up owning everything, that creates an us versus them kind of divide. Although, every once in a while, a game of Monopoly goes really, really well. You ever had a game go like that? Where, like, every single player is actually doing pretty well? And, you know, no one person has an insane amount of wealth, but nobody's doing that badly either. It's like, man, everyone's kind of okay. It's like this upper middle class kind of 90s thing going on. And for my money, the closest thing we've had to something like that, a good game of Monopoly where everyone is doing pretty well, it's the 1950s. I mean, if we could have the economic stability of the 1950s combined with the social justice of today, it would be heaven on earth. Think about it. School was affordable. People weren't going into debt to pay for college. A lot of people didn't even go to college because you could still get a pretty darn good job just with a high school diploma. Only one spouse needed to work. You could buy a house easily, raise kids, put them all through college if you wanted to, take vacations. And these are like just from factory jobs, you know? Most of the workforce was unionized back then. People were doing pretty well, and it was the most robust middle class the world has ever seen. And it was artificially created, you know, from decades and decades of land grants, small business loans, farm subsidies. We created that. If we had just left things to their own Darwinian devices, we'd be in a feudal system right now. But as Jimmy Carter declared, we are no longer in a constitutionally limited democratic republic. This is an oligarchy, and it's time to take the power back and reclaim our republic. Think of it like a chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link. Do you want to have a chain where like maybe 2 or 3 of the links are all nice and shiny and perfect, and maybe they're made out of palladium, and then all the other links are completely rusted, falling apart? There's no way this thing is going to last, right? Or do you want a chain where, hey, you know what? You can count on every single link to hold up, right? That's stability. That's collectivism. I mean, who wants to be a rich man in a poor country? Then you got the whole Wizard of Oz angle with the yellow brick road, the gold standard. And yeah, in the movie, they may have been ruby slippers, but remember in L. Frank Baum's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, they were silver slippers. And remember that quarters themselves used to represent, they used to actually be a quarter of an ounce of silver. They started chipping away at it. I remember like quarters before 1965 still at least had some silver in them. So if you have any quarters laying around from before that date, they're probably worth something. But yeah, basically right now it's just junk. It's just steel. You know, it's play money, monopoly money, right? They're notes of debt. We're just passing around a bunch of IOU notes. So what else did you have in The Wizard of Oz besides the silver slippers representing the silver coins? You had Emerald City, greenbacks. So right there, it sounds like Baum is a proponent of a more diversified currency. Maybe even a full-blown bartering system if you bring some of those poppies into the mix. There's all kinds of different theories as to what Wizard of Oz was really about. I've even heard it said that Dorothy has something to do with Theodore Roosevelt and the original populist movement when it was more of an agrarian thing. And also think about the wizard himself. You know, it's like the Federal Reserve, even though the Federal Reserve didn't exist yet. But, you know, it's like these banking entities behind the scenes. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. It's like market manipulators, right? The magic of turning something phony into something oppressive. Makes me sick. So speaking of greenbacks, John F. Kennedy apparently had some issues with the Federal Reserve. And I don't know if this is just another conspiracy theory, but I believe there's something to it. So check it out. Executive Order number 11110. And basically America was going to start issuing its own treasury notes again and cut out the transnational blood-sucking financial institutions, right? Apparently Abraham Lincoln had some issues with the global banksters as well, and he wound up shot to death, just like JFK did, so definite Illuminati. And the crash of 2008, a lot of people don't realize that $750 billion, that was just an initial figure that was thrown out because it sounded big and it was catchy. We actually wound up handing over closer to 2 trillion taxpayer dollars, and it didn't all go to financial institutions. Remember when Dennis Kucinich was at that congressional committee hearing and he was asking Hank Paulson to name some of the recipients, some of the beneficiaries of those bailouts, and he would not give even one name. Well, that's in part because they were all European, and also a lot of them weren't even in the financial industry. McDonald's got bailout money. Harley Davidson got bailout money. I really don't think that McDonald's needed any help from us, and I don't think that the well-being of Harley Davidson's business was crucial to keeping the American economy together. All right. Needless to say, those banks were too big to fail, and as Bernie Sanders says, they're too big to exist. We need to break them up. You know, get more state chartered banks, go local, support credit unions. Now, we've seen this movie before. Like I said, it happened in 2008. It happened in 1929. And literally, I have seen these movies before, and they're really interesting to rewatch. Check out Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, and Gene Wilder was in that movie too. He was great. And, you know, these guys are going around the country bragging about how they're robbing banks. They're heroes because the banks have been robbing the people, right? Taking some of that power back. And check out They Live by John Carpenter. Remember that? When Roddy Piper shows up to L.A. In L.A., by the way, that has surprisingly few skyscrapers, so it's a trip to watch it. But remember what happened? That movie came out, 87, 88? And he said that he had to come here looking for work because all the banks went under, and all the bastards that caused the banking collapse through predatory lending and through betting against the well-being of their portfolios, these guys gave themselves bonuses when they should have been given prison sentences. It's amazing. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Now, this doesn't mean that capitalism is just inherently evil. No, I mean, when you regulate it, when there's a social component to it, like Teddy Roosevelt said, business needs to be in the interest of the American commons, it can be really good and it can be fun. Some people make the Tiger Woods comparison, right? Hey, just because you're never going to be as good as him doesn't mean you can't enjoy a great game of golf and actually do pretty well. And likewise, just because you're not going to be an inside trader on Wall Street, it doesn't mean you still can't make a lot of money trading and investing. And it doesn't mean that you still can't do really well for yourself and have some fun doing it too. One last thing before I forget about the bailouts. At the time, and I wish I had one in front of me, but there were a lot of sort of alternative breakdowns as to how we could have used those initial bailout funds. And man, oh man, would you believe that with $750 billion, you could have paid off every single mortgage in the United States? Really? I mean, imagine what a boom that would have been to our economy. It would have been like injecting a direct stimulus. People would have had thousands of dollars to, start side businesses and invest in little projects, put away for a rainy day. I mean, you name it. Give to charities. But instead, people had their houses taken away from them by the bloodsuckers. It makes me sick. So I've got kind of an interesting perspective because the very first job that I had in life was at a brokerage firm, Capital Management, but we all called it Capital Punishment, down there in Dana Point, close to Dana Hills. And it was a really interesting job for a 15-year-old. I came in on Saturdays and kind of helped with mailouts. I also made phone calls too. Hey, did you at one time have an interest in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange? And just the absolute recklessness and gambling that led to the recession of 2008. Now, there's a lot of different things that we can do right now, and some of them are pretty simple. I mean, look at the stimulus that Colorado is getting from legalizing cannabis. We can definitely generate a lot more revenue by figuring out a better cannabis system here in California. We can divest to credit unions, which we've talked about before, investing in green energy, especially with an eye toward retrofitting housing with some kind of a reverse income tax or at least buyback bonds so that we can all share in the production of solar energy. And restoring the Sherman Antitrust Act, which came about to prevent corporate monopolies. I mean, it's a serious conflict of interests when just a couple of companies own every single media outlet, and these happen to be the same exact companies that manufacture bombs and toxic pipelines. Do you really think that a news reporter that works for General Electric is going to report on just how dangerous some of these items that their boss is manufacturing is? Boo-boo. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is really important. I think Bill Clinton enforced it once against Microsoft, but besides that, it has not been enforced since the Jimmy Carter era. There's also something taking hold in Los Angeles called the LA Anti-Corruption Act, and I urge everyone to look into it. What it will do eventually, if it becomes law, is provide every voter with 2 vouchers, I believe, valued at $25 each. So you're able to use these 2 vouchers on politicians as you see fit. So rather than a local politician having to go raise money from some oil company or some pharmaceutical company, well, he can just talk to his constituents or her constituents. Talk to the people, let them know what's up, and they will give you one or both of their vouchers if they believe in you. So the Anti-Corruption Act, keep money out of politics. I think it's something that we can all agree on. Something else that would really help create a new economy is the diversification of corporate boards. You look at what's going on in Germany, and this is very similar to the Antitrust Act in that I believe there was another component to that law which stated that you couldn't make more than like 100 or 200 times what the lowest paid worker makes at your company. So let's say you're the CEO of some huge corporate firm. You could only make so much more money than, say, the guy working in the mailroom or the door guy, right? So there were incentives for you to reinvest back into the economy, and that's part of why we had such a stable and expansive economy for so long until Ronald Reagan did away with a lot of those protections. Now, what I was saying about Germany, they have a law which states that every single board of directors has to have at least one person from that lowest income bracket. That means on every single corporate board, there is somebody that maybe works in the mailroom or a custodian or a security officer, and you're getting those points of view, and it's so great that we have boards that are actually looking out for the working guy and not just the people who were the recipients of the lucky sperm lottery club and inherited a lot of wealth and never really had to struggle a day in their lives. All right? So, diversification of boards is a big one. And also, I love this, worker-owned co-ops. You know, as an apprentice at Stevens College, I was inhaling constant sawdust and I was complaining about sinus issues. And a fellow apprentice by the name of Dylan Penders had told me about this thing called NasoPure. It's kind of like a neti pot, one of those things where you irrigate your sinuses, and a lot of people claim that they prevent colds. And he said, hey, go to this place called Hy-Vee. I'm like, Hy-Vee? Never heard of it. And he says, dude, it's where Jesus would shop. And I thought, hey, that's a pretty strong recommendation. So I went on over there, and yeah, it was awesome. They had everything, and people that work there were so helpful. And it's because they're all part owners. Every single person that works there is part owner of the company, so they're happy to help. That's their place. They own it. It's nothing like, I mean, the dude that I knew that worked over at Kohl's that was always trying to rip the place off, and like he was giving me $200 leather jackets for $20 because he switched the tags with some baseball cap, and he was taking part, and he asked for me to help him with something he called Operation Fuck Kohl's. You're definitely not going to hear about any disgruntled employees doing Operation Fuck Hy-Vee because it's a worker-owned co-op. We need to get more of those in our economy. The world's most successful co-op, I believe, is in the Basque region of Spain. So I'm going to reach out to them and try and figure out more about what they're doing. So there's something else that we tried in Echo Park for a little while, and I believe it's taking off in a few other places. It's called time banking. Basically, you donate an hour of your time, and it sits in a bank. You can claim it back however you want. So maybe you walk somebody's dog for an hour, and now you can trade that hour in later on when you need a haircut. It's not the best thing for when you need brain surgery, but it's a really good alternative to the way we trade, and a great bartering system if it's done properly. I think the Echo Park thing got ruined, but who knows? You should try it. I actually have two guests lined up for this episode, so let's get to the first interview.
You're listening to The Populist Papers, a podcast for the people.
Well, our first guest is someone that I met when I was canvassing for Bernie Sanders in 2016, right around the time of the California primary. Speaking of which, I'm actually drinking out of my Feel the Burn coffee mug at the moment, believe it or not. She and I hit it off, obviously, because we have the exact same initials. She's also just one of the most passionate and dedicated people I know of, a true champion for progressive values, the one, the only, Chelsea Kirk.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on. Welcome to the Populist Papers.
Thank you. I look forward to tuning into your podcast for, seeing what the next episodes bring.
All right. That's great. So tell us a little bit about what you've been working on recently.
Sure. Well, surprisingly enough, as of late, I haven't really been working on anything other than academic research for school, which ended just a couple weeks ago. But I did help out with the Get Out the Vote for Imelda Padilla's campaign. She was running for school board in the San Fernando Valley, and that election was on Tuesday. She unfortunately lost to a pro-charter candidate, Kelly Gomez.
Yeah.
So it's quite that, I'm sure you heard, and Steve Zimmer also lost.
Right, and they were both Bernie-endorsed and union-endorsed candidates, but it looked like the charter schools were just putting so much money into it.
So much money. It was really quite a defeat, and, unions have a lot of political clout here in Los Angeles and in California, so it was really quite surprising. And it's sad that the majority of the board will now swing towards pro-charter.
Oh, right. That was pretty empowering, right, for the charter interest, because it really came down to that majority, right?
Oh yeah. But oh gosh, that's a whole other thing. But it is really disappointing, and it's unfortunate that our public funds are going to be funneled into the growth of the charter schools as opposed to helping to improve our public schools, which need it more than anything.
Yeah, how devastating. It was also really, being a registered Democrat, I was getting just so much stuff in the mail about those candidates. And they often say, oh, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I feel like we've moved so far back as far as just the, the sensationalism and the smear campaigns. It was just like, hey, who can find an uglier photograph of their rival? And it's like, come on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was doing door-to-door canvassing, talking to a lot of the residents in that area, and this one woman shared all of her campaign, propaganda that she got in her mailbox with me, and she was like, is this the candidate that you're, speaking on behalf of? And she was showing me a smear attack for the candidate. I'm like, yes, but look who it's funded by, the Charter School Association. So it's, a lot of people were really grateful that I knocked on their door. They like the opportunity to talk to someone face to face and kind of explain to them the issues. When you're getting, negative and positive ads in your mailbox, how do you really come to a conclusion, right? It's all just kind of rhetoric. There are not enough resources available to, send people door to door and hit all the residents. So, of course, the easiest way is to send, flyers and, campaign literature.
Sure.
That's how we win elections in California. We send a lot of, we inundate people with campaign flyers.
Right, and that was something that I loved about canvassing during the Bernie campaign, was going out there. It's not like we were just going door to door, we were only knocking on doors of people that had already expressed some interest in the Sanders platform, and we were just there, not asking for money, but just checking in and reminding people, hey, your polling place may have moved. Remember, it's this Tuesday, little things like that. And also, there were a lot of people that were kind of undecided about Hillary and Bernie. So it was nice to kind of help nudge them. But really, it was just connecting, and getting to know those people and saying, hey, we're not alone. There's a lot of really smart people out there, and we're not going anywhere.
Right, absolutely. What's interesting is just getting off of this local city council campaign. A lot of people don't like to do the canvassing. A lot of volunteers feel kind of uncomfortable going door to door and talking about issues just because you're fronted with strangers. And a lot of people, I got the door slammed in my face more than a few times. But what you realize is when you're on the right side of the argument, it's just so easy to talk to people. You're not, trying to memorize talking points. You're actually just speaking from your heart. And that's how I felt canvassing for Bernie. That's how I felt canvassing for my candidate about tenants issues, and that's how I felt talking about why we need to see money in public schools. Again, when you're on the right side of the issue, it's easier to talk about.
Definitely.
But anyways, I did the GOTV for Imelda Padilla, but that I was not focused on that campaign. I only helped out at the tail end of it. But now that school's finished, I do plan on being endlessly involved in tenant advocacy. That's kind of where my interest lays. I'll be joining the Los Angeles Tenants Union's Policy Committee. They need a lot of help right now. And, I don't know if you know much about the LA Tenants Union, but It's a really momentous organization focused on tenant advocacy, and the policy committee works specifically to push tenant-oriented legislation through the city council. And recently, one of the most significant things that's happened is the introduction of AB 1506, and it's a state bill seeking to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the Costa-Hawkins, it's a statewide law, it was enacted in 1995, and it precludes vacancy control in the state of California. And this is a much-needed rent control provision that, has been a demand of tenants organizations for a long time. And so right now that's kind of the focus of the policy committee. They're, focusing on outreach efforts and organizing and support of the bill, which isn't going to be pushed through the legislature until 2018. And so that's kind of what I plan to focus on in the coming months.
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is a really serious issue. And I mean, if people aren't already kind of focused on just how overburdened Angelenos are with housing. I mean, I remember my mom telling me that her economics classes in the 1960s would kind of get into that, like, okay, you're going to want to budget like 10% of your income for housing. And now, I mean, it's common for people to blow more than half of their paychecks on rent. Do you have any ideas how we got to this point?
Yeah. I mean, some people are paying as much as 60%.
Wow.
Also, and today, 30%. If you're paying more than 30%, you are cost burdened. If you're paying any more than that, you're severely cost burdened. But you know what? It's interesting because in Los Angeles, the city has kind of been braving this housing crisis since the city's inception. The city has always been seeking ways to solve the housing shortage. I mean, even as far back as the Great Depression, right? After the Great Depression, the housing construction froze, but the need for housing continued to increase as more people were moving into the city. After the war, the housing market became even more overwhelmed as, people were moving back in. But during that time, construction, it wasn't oriented towards housing. Developers were interested in building commercial developments and not, housing for affordable or low-income people or for veterans. And we see this today. So that's like a trend that, it's very entrenched. And it started back then, and we still see it today. A lot of the new construction is oriented towards luxury housing, not housing for low-income or even moderate-income residents. And furthermore, we also see the depletion of our current, affordable housing stock, which, because of its age, is by default more affordable than the new units being added to the market. It's interesting if you want me to kind of go on like a historical, tangent, but this kind of started with the Housing Act of 1954. This has kind of been the, focus of my study in school as well. That's when the kind of urban renewal started, this like concept of urban renewal. And Bunker Hill is a really interesting example. Like back in 1955, Bunker Hill was chosen as a site for redevelopment because the city commissioned a report concluding that, about 60% of its structures were blighted. And at that time, Bunker Hill was a hilltop. It was, of mansions and rooming houses, and, this provided some of the cheapest housing for downtown's low-income workers and immigrants and veterans. And when the city approved this plan, essentially 2,000 dwellings were demolished and 12,000 tenants were displaced, meaning, 12,000 people lost their homes at the whim of the city deciding that their homes were dilapidated and needed to be, raised and redeveloped.
Jeez.
Yeah, and, what's worse is that development actually froze. So Bunker Hill remained vacant for decades. And it wasn't until, I believe, like 1980 where construction started again. And instead of building housing units to replace the 2,000 dwelling units that it demolished, it was commercial units for office buildings. And those units ended up remaining vacant because there was no demand for them. So we see happening today, even though that started back in the 50s. People today, people who've lived in their apartments for decades, are receiving eviction notice after eviction notice on a daily basis. This is happening to tenants all around the city, telling them that they need to move out because their homes are going to be demolished and turned into, small lot homes, for example. And, why is this happening? Well, because the owner of the property is interested in turning a profit. The private market can't be relied on to provide affordable and decent housing because the people who participate in this are interested in, making money. And right now in LA, as a lot more of these neighborhoods become more popular and as real estate is climbing, essentially people who own property are realizing that, renting to long-term tenants who've been here for decades isn't as lucrative as joining the short-term rental industry or leaving the rental market altogether and selling the property. And what this means is that people are losing their homes. And people, because in Los Angeles we have no tenants protections legislation that really secure tenants, you just have a lot of displacement happening. And as you're displacing people, you're pretty much removing these once affordable units of housing where people of modest income live and replacing them with more expensive housing, which is directly increasing housing costs, or it's, causing the surrounding housing costs to increase. And because we don't have any strict rent control, people can have their rent increased to them at unreasonable rates. So when the property owner realizes that market rate has increased significantly, they're going to just raise the rent because it's more profitable for them. And so this is, families either swallow the burden and keep trying to pay it, which makes, this can mean 60% of their income, or they move out to cheaper neighborhoods that are usually more economically depressed and have less opportunities. So I guess my point altogether is that, this is a trend we've seen. It began long ago, but now it's culminated into this, people are more aware of it. It's felt more strongly, especially as it's expanding, outside of downtown to, neighborhoods like Echo Park, and, even Highland Park, even more northeast than that, and East Boyle Heights. It's just expanding, and more people are getting more upset about it.
Yeah, I actually moved to Echo Park right after I finished college in 2006. So it was bizarre being there right at that time. I think Time Out magazine had published that Silver Lake was the coolest neighborhood on earth. And just, all of a sudden, the rents started going up. They started doubling. I mean, for businesses, sometimes the rent would be tripled. I know that's Hollywood has a history of doing that. And it seems like this is almost more of a cultural issue that maybe it's a failure in getting the message out that, to be success, you can make plenty of money just as things are. You don't have to, kick everybody out and destroy, where I went to college, actually, that community, they've just ripped out all of these beautiful old little houses and they've put in just the cheapest, ugliest, little apartment buildings and stuff. And so, I mean, how do you think we can get this message out that it's not just about making a little bit more money? We've got historic preservation. It's a national security issue. I mean, if people are kicked out of their places, they've got nothing to lose. If people are spending all of their money on housing, there's nothing left over to generate back into our local economy. And these, it's so common in Los Angeles for a regular house to be kind of maximized into multiple units. Like, oh, let's turn downstairs into a separate apartment. Let's turn that little storage unit into its own apartment. And now we've got high density. And I mean, I can't even imagine what's going to happen if a fire or earthquake happens to some of these units. So, I mean, what do you think we can do just as far as kind of getting the message out that it's not just about profits?
Right. I mean, I think that's not just obviously an LA issue. I think that's just American values. It's always been about profiteering and making money, and our communities are very community oriented. Everyone's pretty self-interested, and people are worried about themselves as individuals and about their immediate family unit. And I don't think there's much of a concern for people outside of that. I don't think that, oh gosh, it's such an uphill battle. Changing people's values is the hardest thing, but it's the most necessary. And I think that what needs to happen in LA is, you can say that, as you pointed out, it's people wanting to make a profit and turn a profit and renters lose their home at the whim of a greedy landlord or a greedy developer. But what has really facilitated this is city and state laws. And I think that, if you regulate the market and you push for policies that limit what, landlords and developers can do, that's when we can start seeing some changes. I think that, we don't have tenants protections legislation. We never really have. Our rent stabilization ordinance is very weak relatively. And that's why the whole Costa-Hawkins repeal is what the LA Tenants Union is really focusing on, because what that does is it vacancy control provision. Right now, if that's repealed, vacancy control provision would be legal. And what vacancy control is essentially, if I pay $1,000 for my apartment right now and I decide to leave my apartment on my own volition, the next tenant that comes into my apartment would also have to pay $1,000. The landlord couldn't raise the rent to $1,500, which is what's happening right now, and I've seen it in my own apartment complex. My last neighbor was paying like $1,100. My new neighbor's paying $1,700.
Wow!
So that's how rents continue to increase. But what vacancy control does is it limits. So if I left, the next tenant couldn't pay more than what I paid. And what this does is, so right now what you have is there's an attack on low-income people, mostly non-English speaking and elderly people, A lot of landlords are trying to circumvent certain provisions in the rent stabilization ordinance to try to get tenants to move out on their own to get higher-paying tenants. So you have, landlords using harassment tactics, which they don't think they'll get in trouble for since they're dealing with vulnerable communities, non-English-speaking people who, don't really exercise their rights or aren't aware of their rights.
Right.
And they try to get them to move out because there's a profit incentive that exists because of the fact that we don't have vacancy control. If you eliminate that profit incentive, there's no reason for the landlord to harass that tenant and try to get them to move out because he's not going to make any more money off of him.
Interesting.
So that's why vacancy control is a big deal. It's been a big demand of tenants organizations, and that's why it's huge. I mean, I couldn't even believe that, a assemblyman would put this through or would introduce this. It's really contentious. It was passed essentially because, developers pour a lot of money into campaigns in California and in Los Angeles, and they thought that, they used the rhetoric that if you passed rent control, if we had vacancy control, it would preclude development. It would slow down development, and there would be no incentive to develop much needed housing. But what you need to realize is that right now the construction that's happening isn't benefiting anyone except developers who are enriching themselves through the process and people who can afford to pay these outrageous rents of the new units that are being added to the market. And a lot of these new housing units are also staying vacant. I mean, between 2010 and 2014, 44% of units that were added to the market, or not added to the market, that were constructed, remained vacant. They were speculative. So they were being withheld, from the market until, the best time to release them to get the most profit would be. And again, we don't have any city laws or anything outlawing this. We don't have a vacancy tax. And because of these things, because of city and state law that has essentially created a deregulated housing market, you're going to keep seeing these things happen. You're going to see these profiteers exploiting the situation because, there's no regulation. So I think that as much as values need to change, again, 62% of renters in the city, or 62% of residents in the city are renters. We far outnumber the greedy landlords. But they have the most political clout because they have the most money, But I don't think we'll change their values, but we could change city and state policy.
I like it. Yeah, I noticed that, especially as you were saying around 2010, just all these mega luxury units started going up, like those ones on Sunset close to downtown. And you can tell, just like, what is it, 7 years later now, just driving by, you can tell it's more than half empty. Just looking at the balconies and whatnot. And it's like, what a waste. There are so many historic buildings that just needed a little bit of fixing up,
Right.
And or retrofitting. And most of the people in that area, they're artists or they're young people or, they're just going to go a little bit deeper into downtown and get something more affordable. They're not going to do like these maxed out luxury units, It's definitely a disconnect between values there. I don't want to just make it seem like it's us versus them, though, because it should be a win-win situation. I know Food and Water Watch has been doing some great work fighting for a 100% clean energy Los Angeles, and I would love to see this. So let me know if you have any thoughts, but what Alaska does with resource sharing. You know, they've got their Alaska Permanent Fund, I think it's called, and basically all the citizens, property owners and non-property owners, get to share in the profits that the state makes from the oil. So how do you think maybe we could incentivize property owners and legislators to retrofit, residences so that maybe we can share in the profits from solar production?
I'm not very familiar with it. I know that California produces a glut of energy, and I'm not very familiar with the Alaska Permanent Fund. Is this fund, do they just get like a tax rebate? Is that how?
Yeah, I believe it is. And that's part of the irony is Sarah Palin is actually the biggest socialist probably in the United States because it's by how many family members you have. I think like you get an extra $1,000. And you're right. It's like at the end of the year. So I think it basically serves as like a reverse income tax. And just, considering that Germany, the cloudiest country in Europe right now, they're overloading their electrical apparatus because they're producing so much solar right now. And that came from retrofitting old houses. And it just seems like, wow, we're in the Southwest. We produce so much solar, not to mention wave, tidal power, wind power. There's got to be a way we can kind of bring property owners and the clean energy movement together where we can pass some of the savings on to renters.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I guess I'm not familiar enough to speak to it. But I will say, it's, what that looks like is a tax rebate for renters. An interesting comment that Rusty Hicks made from the union was that, despite, our workers, our union members who get good wages, these wages are gobbled up by increasing rent. So, if an extra additional $500 a month, I don't know how much that's going to help someone. I think it is going to have to come down to really regulating the market. And right now, our city leadership doesn't have the political will, and that is primarily because the development industry funds these candidates. And they do them favors, political favors. But that's what I would have to say to that. I think there is a need for a continuous, permanent funding source for affordable housing construction. There's not much affordable housing construction going on. It's incredibly expensive, and of course, for-profit developers aren't willing to do it. And a lot of the nonprofit developers they don't have enough money to acquire land. And they also, receive a lot of community backlash too. Recently in Boyle Heights, there's a community project, an affordable housing project that, it's in the process of being reviewed and it wants to go up, but it's receiving so much community backlash because people in the surrounding neighborhood, a supermarket owner right next door to where the project would go up, isn't happy with the idea of a housing structure that would serve low-income tenants and formerly homeless people. They're using the arguments that, this would be unsafe for the children in the neighborhood. Right. So these are some hurdles that people don't realize also when we talk about, constructing and building as a solution. The city, Mayor Garcetti loves to talk about how we're going to build our way out of the housing crisis. There's never a focus on preserving affordable housing. There's never a focus on giving tenants more protections from landlords. Rather, there's this let's keep building and building and building. There's a shortfall of 500,000 units in the county. If we just keep building and incentivize developers to build more, we forget that there's all these obstacles and the kind of housing construction that needs to happen isn't happening because of these obstacles. And no one, it isn't part of the narrative. The city doesn't talk about these obstacles, but it promotes housing construction, and mostly because they're backed by developers. In my opinion, that's what's happening. So we're going to need to see a shift in city leadership before we see some real changes and some real innovation as to how we can solve this issue and kind of unite property owners and tenants what's interesting is that in the history of housing in Los Angeles, you've had these three different stakeholders. You've had developers, property owners, and tenants, and they've all either come together or have been against each other. In the past, property owners and developers sided against tenants because they're interested in property values going up. So property owners like development because they wanted to see property value in Los Angeles to increase. Today, what's interesting is that there are a lot of property owners, mostly historic preservationists, who've had the same objectives as tenants in Los Angeles. Tenants are interested in saving rent-stabilized buildings, and a lot of property owners are interested in preserving historical buildings, and these buildings tend to overlap because they're older buildings, meaning they're rent-stabilized, buildings before 1979. So you see property owners and tenants coming together, maybe for different reasons, but ultimately seeking the same thing. Property owners, a lot of them, mostly the mom and pop ones, the lower tier property owners, are interested in preserving the culture of LA, and they're really fighting back against, real estate investors, developers, and the property owners that have exploited Los Angeles because of its high market and real estate value. You have, these people are a lot of these people who are, responsible for all these new structures going up, these luxury housing buildings, are people from the community, and if they were in the community, they know that the community doesn't want these things. So what you have is, these industries have monopolized like real estate in Los Angeles, and they just have so much power because they've bought out, mom and pop property owners. You have real estate investors encouraging people who own property to cash out so they can acquire more and more property, and they become bigger players in the game.
Monopolize.
And
yeah, that's really unfortunate, and it's consolidation and centralization. I mean, that's basically cancerous. When one thing becomes too dominant. What do they say? Variety is the spice of life. And it really saddens me. This is something that also came up in our homelessness episode. The way property owners just see these people as like a threat to their profits or something. Just send them somewhere else. When we should be looking at, how we can serve the community and how we can kind of tackle these issues together when we just centralize all of the people with problems over in one side of town. Then we've got Skid Row, we've got one dangerous neighborhood. Whereas if just every neighborhood had one modest facility to help out the mentally ill and or homeless, then, we wouldn't have Skid Row. So it seems really messed up to me. So remind us.
Right.
Go ahead.
And that that goes back to what you're saying. Like, it seems like it's a cultural thing. When I went to one of the first hearings in Los Angeles about the AB 1506, assembly members came down to hear what residents of Los Angeles had to say about the housing crisis and how it's manifested here. You had tenants, and then you had property owners in the same room speaking, going up and speaking their mind, and it was just sad to hear what some of these property owners had to say. A few of them, expressed concerns about it's too expensive for me to keep up my building. If you repeal this, and I can't increase rent, I can't afford to upkeep the building. But then most of the people were actually just slurring, like, this is communism, like, if you repeal this is communism, like, don't infringe my rights and my liberty, like, I'm allowed to be a property owner, like, all this rhetoric, this emotive rhetoric that was just totally, you can just tell that these people, probably owned multiple buildings in Los Angeles, probably didn't even live in Los Angeles, had no idea really who their tenants were, they're just figures for them. So that's just really sad, and that's what happens when, you don't empower tenants, and tenants see landlords as enemies now just because of what's happened. They're distant, they don't live on the property, they don't visit, they come to collect checks or come to evict people, and it is cultural. But again, I think that because of that, and I don't see cultural values really changing anytime soon, city policy needs to be put in place to help regulate the market and give protections to tenants.
Okay, so what's the next step? Should our listeners be calling their representatives and tell them to support the repeal of, what is it, AB 1506?
Yeah, Absolutely. The bill will not be going through the legislature till 2018. I think that for residents of Los Angeles, renters in Los Angeles, joining a tenant organization like the Los Angeles Tenants Union is really important. I mean, it works in the same way as, well, it works like a union works. There are many different chapters, many meetings, and, you know, when you're just calling your representatives, you're still kind of just doing this act on your own, which is also very helpful. But when you're part of, like, the tenants union, you're part of this collective of people who are fighting for, you know, the justice of tenants and tenants protections and doing tenant advocacy. And I think that if, and I don't know if this will ever happen, but if the tenants union could grow enough to get enough members, enough active members who pay dues and work as a union does in the way like maybe a labor union does, I think that in time, if they do enough outreach and enough organizing and enough good work, because there are, again, 62% of residents in Los Angeles are renters. We have enough money for votes, because I think the way we get change is through the electoral process. We have, you know, if the LA Tenants Union can grow large enough, you know, and get some political clout, and you know maybe have a real stake and you know a real influence on elections, I think that we could start seeing some change. I think that the tenants organizations right now are maybe the most active and organized as they've ever been. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think what's happening is pretty great, and I think if it continues to grow, that'll be the way to do it. But I do know that the Tenants Union will be organizing door-to-door canvassing, I believe, probably to, encourage people to call their representatives. Their state assembly members would be called first, kind of to encourage them and let them know how they feel about the Costa-Hawkins repeal.
I love it. Well, I definitely agree. People seem really energized right now, and it feels like maybe it's a generational thing, but we are approaching a real tipping point, maybe a paradigm shift. So consider this a call to action. Check out the LA Tenants Union. Well, Chelsea, thank you so much for coming on, and congrats on finishing up school. Do you have any final thoughts or recommendations for our listeners?
Absolutely. I do have a recommended reading for people interested in housing in Los Angeles and just kind of the history of, where we are right now as far as our housing crisis. And it's The City of Quartz by Mike Davis. It's kind of
yes, I've read it.
Yeah, it's great. So that's all. Thank you for having me on. It was great speaking with you.
And City of Quartz, not quartz with a C, but Quartz, for those that didn't catch that.
Yes, that is correct.
I made that mistake myself. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Chelsea. It was great having you. And thank you so much for all the wonderful work that you're doing for LA.
Of course. All right. Thank you.
You're
welcome.
Have a good one. You too. Talk to you later.
Bye.
My next guest is the co-organizer of Divest LA as well as Revolution LA. He hosts a series called Age of Reason, which I highly recommend, and it can be found on YouTube. Phoenix Goodman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be on.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and some of the work that Revolution LA has been doing.
Sure. Well, I am working with Revolution LA, which I'm a co-organizer of. We've been a grassroots organization for a little over 2 years under great leadership of Trinity, who's my colleague, co-organizer and founder. And throughout the years, we mainly focused on, getting the community educated, doing community projects. We improved the basement of a church, and it was a place where they taught kids and did after school programs, and it was a mess. So we organized a bunch of people to improve that. We've done documentary screenings, things like that. So it was more just like a community thing. But we started to develop a grand agenda of what things we wanted to happen in the world. But it's been exponential, really since the beginning of this year. Exponential not only because of a boost of enthusiasm from Trump's inauguration, but the stars really aligned. What basically happened is Divest LA was formed. That's been where all the action has been at. What Divest LA is a move to have $8 billion of Los Angeles' public deposits, its funds that it banks with, are currently in Wells Fargo. We're looking to get that out of Wells Fargo and into a bank that does not invest in DAPL in solidarity with the Standing Rock movement, as momentum nationwide that started with Seattle, the divestment movement. But where we're going from here is very exciting, because while we're in the process of getting that divestment happening and taking on Wells Fargo with very real results, I think within the year, there's a lot more evolution that we're excited to see going forward.
Right. People really seem to be waking up. And Santa Monica is already a step ahead. They voted unanimously to divest, right?
Absolutely. It really goes to show that on a city level, having the right politicians in power can really do wonders. A single city council person in Seattle, Kshama Sawant, who is open-minded to a degree much greater than the status quo politicians that usually have the seat. That the whole divestment movement started because all it takes is one person to be bold to push the agenda and create a new narrative. So, and what we've been dealing with here is we're dealing with a very, very large city, a very large portfolio, and conservative-minded people who are all about the money, who really don't see the moral need to do this per se, but they'll react to political pressure, and that's, the game that we've had to play.
Sure. People really take for granted, at least it seems to me, how much of an impact they can have at the local level. And what's great about it, I mean, you're right, they do respond to pressure. It's a lot harder to hide from your constituents when, you can run into us at the grocery store. And, it tends to be less partisan. So people tend to get things done a little bit more quickly on the local level. But, I mean, what do you say to people that are just like, oh, it's all corrupt, it's all rigged, and they don't vote, they don't even participate at a local level? How can we kind of build even more momentum?
Yeah, I think that's a very on-point question, because when you point to the merits of local civics, I would go so far as to say that I do believe that this is like the paradigm shift, because I think over the last 10, 20 years with the internet, little by little, people are waking up to enormous degrees compared to what before. Now, there's some collateral damage. Now, there's a lot of conspiracies that people believe that aren't true, but there's a lot of real conspiracies that people are rising up to, mostly in financial in nature. And the swearing in of Trump, I think, is really solidifying an era right now, or ending an old era. I think really from 1989 to 2016 will be an era, the post-Cold War era, and we are now in a new era, post-Trump. And it's only the early ages of that. And I think we're facing a major breakdown of the world order that we're used to, which is par course in history, right? That's how history unfolds. Nothing's ever stable forever, as every empire that's ever existed will attest to. And the reason why I bring that up, though, about the city is because now we're losing so much faith in Washington, so gridlocked, so corrupt, that a city council member is accessible. Getting them in requires a much smaller vote count, a much easier campaign to win if you can mobilize correctly, because it's a lot smaller people and it's all right there. Mm-hmm. And a single law, a stroke of a pen, can have massive implications at the local level, and it's extremely accessible. That's the revolution. It's not like Occupy getting in the streets. It's getting progressives in the city council and pushing bold agendas at city council. That's going to be the next wave.
Yeah, actually learning how to get things done. It's, the system may be broken. I see it more like, hey, it just has bugs in it. It's still a very usable system. We just need to become more part of the process.
Big time. I think the system fundamentally could use a reboot in many ways, but it's not like we're starting from square zero. A lot of freedom fighters of the past, we can thank for some good things we have today, and we should leverage that. Mm-hmm. We have the ability to vote leaders in and be visionary, but the problem has been, I think, a culture of apathy and a culture of just live and let live on a very, very deep level, to the point where we're not even worrying about how bold we can be with legislation. But the future of what we're doing is going to be a public bank, and that's going to be phase 2 of the divest movement. And we believe that has the power to transform the entire system as a whole. Paradigm shifting levels.
Sure. Economics. Well, and that's why the theme of this episode is newfangled economics, because that's such a core issue that seems to, transcend the left-right paradigm that could bring about, and there's so many different aspects to it. Like you said, there's this unrealized potential out there, but how do we get the message across? And it's going to be really interesting with people power now and everything going viral so quickly. How can we tap into that, maybe with like an activist app or some kind of sharing platform? Because I can't tell you how nauseated it makes me every time I hear somebody talking about, like, the liberal national media. It's like, I'm sorry, I've never heard a single person in the national media say anything about the advantages of worker-owned co-ops, or how the citizens of the state actually own. That's why we're called commonwealths. We own the resources. The oil shouldn't be, being given over to private companies. We should be using using that. I mean, we could affect a negative income tax. So it's going to be really interesting where we go from here. But first, I want to hear a little bit more of your story. I mean, what brought you to this point? Was there a particular aha moment where you knew, like, hey, this is it, activism is going to be a big part of my life from now on? Or did you have like a mentor that kind of inspired you?
It started with my very inquisitive mind and just starting off going into the rabbit hole online, right? You ever have those nights where you just have 10 tabs of Wikipedia and YouTube open?
Oh, at least.
So in a period of my life where I was going through that, I went through the rabbit hole of conspiracies, but not to a crazy degree, but to a degree where I was really learning at an exponential pace what was going on in the world. And that was the beginning of wanting to, but feeling like, the world is so big around my, young self. Occupy was kind of picking up at that time. I was not involved in Occupy. This was before I actually had developed that level of consciousness, but it was in the zeitgeist, right? It was kind of like, this is happening around me and this is becoming interesting.
Yeah. You could feel it.
I could feel it. And, the more literature that I consumed online that was about that, the more, radicalized in the sense I could become. But I use that word in a positive way. And, really what ended up happening, I think synergy is just insanely important, right? If anybody's like listening and wondering how can I become effective, I can't explain. I can't explain enough how amazing the idea of one person that's really good at one thing, and then another person that's good at another thing, and then they support each other in their synergy, and then 4 or 5 people come together as a group, and they all bring in something different, but at the same time are focused in vision and mission. By doing that and having bold vision and willpower, amazing things can happen. And I say that because we started off in a coffee shop. I was at Revolution LA's second meeting, and all we did was just talk, kind of like a conversation we're having now, just talking about stuff. Mm-hmm. And this is the beginning of Revolution LA. Fast forward with an incredible amount of willpower and leadership. Trinity, who's been running it, is really ambitious with her work ethic and vision, and that synergized with the incredible team that's built up all together, the alliances with all the incredible people. It becomes exponential. And next thing you know, when there's the right place, the right time, and the right energy, things can really become meaningful within a short period of time. And that's what's happened with us.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I feel it every time I show up to one of the strategy meetings or the other events. It's when I can make it. I have such a hectic schedule, but it's like food for me when I'm there. I leave just so rejuvenated. I'm just talking to people nonstop. It's like, get on the phone. You're not still with Wells Fargo, are you? Come on, Mom. Like, pull your money out of there. Those bastards are laundering drug money for fucking terrorists and invading native sovereign territory. It's like the 60s never ended. It's us that changed. It's time to bring that back. So, I mean, it is amazing what a difference we can make. So back to that. Yeah. Talking about credit unions and divestment and the effort, to kind of break up the big banks, basically. I mean, there's so many good reasons for it. And I've brought it up on this show before, but for some reason still I'm being met with this resistance. It's the same old excuses like, there's confusion about the FDIC issues. They say they like their bank or it's more accessible. So, can you just break it down?
Just to ask you, when you're talking about divesting, you're talking about like individuals getting out of their bank account into like a credit unions.
Sure, on an individual level.
On the individual level, right. I believe very much on the individual divestment. I think that is a narrative that we should keep on pushing and keep on getting people to do personally and encouraging their family and friends. I moved from Wells Fargo to a credit union, and it felt really good. It took me a while because the convenience factor really bogged me down. But doing what I was doing, I had to, be in line with my values. So I did it, and with not too much effort, it's not that big of a deal, and it feels a lot better, and it's a great institution. So I definitely think we should do that. I will say this. I am wary for people to focus too much on the individual consumption narrative side of things. And because I do feel that that's, in a sense, a deflection from the power of synergy and collective, legislation. I'll give you an example. So there was a legislation passed in the city recently about plastic bags in supermarkets, right?
Right.
Now you could create a whole campaign, and the amount of resources you would put in to get X amount of people to actually choose one or the other. And there's not that high barrier to entry, right? You can just choose one, so it's not that big of a deal. But a lot of people will still use plastic. But with a single stroke of a pen through a single legislation, all plastic is banned from the entire city, right? So legislation is powerful because laws are like the premises, and then the conclusions are what flows from that. And that applies to the legal system as well. And so the key is I think that there's a libertarian fallacy that you see so many bad laws, and so you say, that's bad, look how evil the power of government is, so we need to decrease it. The question is not a matter of size necessarily. There are questions of size, but not in this case. I think it's about quality. And if we have enlightened laws that can actually leverage the banking system, not only divest individuals, but get the entire city to get out of the banks. Yeah, we might invest a few $1 million or hundreds of millions even on an individual divestment, but with a single stroke of a pen, we can move $8 billion. So it's important to look at things from that macro level too. More important, in my opinion, in tandem with the individual.
That's really incredible. I mean, 8 billion. Imagine what we could do, and just with a modest interest rate that could really put so much into our schools and into our roads and whatnot. And there's no reason why we should be letting these transnational, blood banksters be taking these exorbitant interest rates. I mean, and I'm so glad I use a credit union because they're much more reasonable, when you do fuck up and there's some kind of fee or something. And, they'll even give you like free check or free money orders if you run out of checks. And banks just nickel and dime you on every little thing. And it's like, what for? And the fact that they are transnational, it seems like this is kind of a conservative issue because to have a state chartered bank, it's less of a conflict of interest with sovereignty issues.
Yeah, I think that the public bank solution is going to be one of those aha moments in the movement. And when I say the movement, I mean the general, like the popular uprising in its general sense, right? Mm-hmm. That's happening. I think that the public bank solution is going to be one of the most clutch, key things that will make the biggest difference. Because name something screwed up in the world, okay? Like war, fossil fuels, all the structural stuff. Mm-hmm. All roads lead to the banks because everything requires funding, okay? So all roads lead to the banks. And so when you think about that and you think about the amount of power the circulatory system of the economy has, by putting private bankers in charge of the power to create and lend money, you're putting the vampires in charge of the blood bank. It's not even the reason why I don't even like to think of it as right or left is because to me it's like, no, this is just rational. It's literally irrational to have private bankers. It just doesn't make sense on a logical level. Because the banks that are public can have a charter that can invest all that money. The infrastructure that we loan, the infrastructure loans that a city gets, if they want to build a school, if they want to build a bridge or a road, and they have to buy bonds to do that, they have to get a loan. The fact is the bank will give that loan, and people don't know this. Here's a good fact. You're going to have to give back, or the city has to give it back, almost the amount that they originally borrowed back in interest and fees, doubled, in other words. That is extractive, and that comes from tax dollars. That is literally Wall Street with a big leech or pipe, it's plugged into your city and then sucking out the tax dollars that you work for. It's theft. It's structural bank robbery, reverse. So the $100 million that Los Angeles paid in fees last year, $100 million in fees to the banks for their services, if that went to the city, as you mentioned, what could that invest in? If that was reinvested in schools and in other pro-social programs, it's literally a no-brainer. And this is what we're going to fight for: is the public bank solution on a state and a municipal level, nationwide.
Wow. So it seems like, on your point about this being central to so many other issues, it's kind of like they say, follow the money. But it's not just the money itself. It's not like money is evil. Money's neutral. It's this love of money. And it seems like what you're getting at is more of a greater paradigm shift, that maybe what we're looking at, perhaps even in our lifetimes, is kind of a post-scarcity mentality. I mean, do you think it's possible to be in kind of a post-scarcity world in our lifetime?
I definitely believe that in order to get to post-scarcity, we need to have the prerequisite, government and economic system that can lead to that, and that's what this revolution that's coming now will lead into, is that prerequisite system. Now, do I think we'll reach post-scarcity in our lifetime? I would say if we are probably elders, we might. I see it happening in decades, like a handful of decades, right? But within 1 to 200 years, I would say, is when the post-scarcity world can realistically come to be. And I do believe that the banking system, the public banking system, is a prerequisite to that. To what you say, it's not about money per se, because money is just like a neutral, amoral energy at the end of the day. But the system that uses that energy can harness that energy for plunder and greed and factional interests at the expense of the common good, or it can be funneled towards enlightened investment towards, positive pro-social and pro-environmental things. And so all we have to do is rethink the economic infrastructure of the economy itself, the fundamentals, and the rest will flow. You have a public bank that is the source of all the funds, and then they have a charter or a mandate that they have to invest in pro-social things and in pro-environmental things. Overnight, the financial industry is revolutionized. That can be applied across the board.
Complete overhaul. Would it be a start if we would at least do what Iceland did? Would it be too late to throw all of the banksters in jail and take the bailout money and give it to the people to help pay off their mortgages and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe that is technically possible and preferable. But the difference with Iceland is a small island nation, kind of like this homogenous, low population, very tight kind of country. So they have to them, national is local simultaneously.
Right.
Whereas America, in its like fundamental makeup, are different states, different cultures, vast like empire territorially, right? Different races. It's just a very, very, very different kind of animal. And so I think that our revolution isn't necessarily going to come from by attacking the Mordor or the Central Station or the Death Star, however you want to look at it. It's not going to be that type of victory. I think it's going to be more of, in a ironic way, this is something a lot of conservatives is like the whole localism thing. But I do believe it's going to come from cities and states standing up against the conservative backlash and then creating their own self-destiny and kicking the banks out by creating public banking systems that make them irrelevant, sweep the power out from under them.
Right. And that would be a lot more stable anyway, because we don't have that big, too big to fail mentality when we centralize and consolidate everything in one place.
Right, exactly.
Interesting.
And here's the other thing, is that's also a part of, they're also casinos, right? That's what it actually is. Yeah, they have banking services, but these Wall Street funds are simply casinos where they are the house and they're the players. And then we're the dupes, basically, that get raped and pillaged. So
yeah,
that's unstable. We need to manifest a new economy that stabilizes boom and bust, for sure.
Right. And kind of puts up protections so we don't have these bubble markets anymore. I've got an interesting point of view because, believe it or not, my very first job when I was 15 years old was at a commodity brokerage firm. And this dude, I usually introduced him as my cousin. Really, it was just a guy that rented a room in my mom's house. But, like, he wound up staying for years, and he liked her more than his real parents. So we kind of introduced him as like, oh, yeah, that's my cousin. He stays here. But I worked for him for a little while. And he was like a top, well, it was weird. First, he was a broker. Then it's like he's a trader. Then I remember by the end of his career, he was like, oh, no, I don't do any of that stuff. I'm just a speculator. And it's just like, just from those 3 name changes alone, you see this like lack of accountability happening.
Yeah.
And those guys knew that it was all a scam. And there was even a documentary floating around. It was a double VHS set called, maybe you've seen it, The Money Masters.
No, I haven't seen that one, but I've seen quite a few other ones.
Yeah. And they get into the whole history with the Rothschilds and how, you know, it really was a great thing at first, issuing banknotes in exchange for coins, because we were still somewhat nomadic back then. And if you're traveling around Europe, you don't want to haul around every single, you know, precious metal that you own. You want a few notes, you know, and then exchange it as you go. So it was just this great thing. But yeah, it was interesting because that was right around the time they were getting ready to repeal Glass-Steagall. And there's a whole nother, you know, can of worms right there with the Clintons and Hillary getting ready to run for New York, her senatorial race, because the Wall Street guys definitely wanted them to break it up. But we've seen this movie before, you know, these bubble markets, the boom and bust, as you mentioned. It happened in the 1920s, and that's why we put Glass-Steagall into effect, so that banks could be just these stable, kind of boring entities where we could deposit our money. They weren't supposed to be casinos. And when we said, like, hey, who cares? Just do whatever you want with this money. You guys know best.
On the one hand, the liberal part of me wants to say, yes, those protections, we need those regulations, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on a deeper level, I think that at the end of the day, it all represents a system that is not ideal, and that those regulations are part of kind of the elite light. Like the Democratic Party is like the center-right, still elitist party. And within the oligarchies, you have kind of, I think, this faction that is just more brash, straight to the point, rape the people of everything they have, child labor if you have to, I don't give a fuck. And I think that there's the left wing of the elite that say, no, we like our system, but let's just kind of like give enough bones to keep it placated to stave off the revolution. They're a little smarter about keeping the revolution staved off. Whereas the way I look at it is like, I don't think the answer is just regulating Wall Street, right? That misses the point. And to me, I see that as a steam valve to guide left wing mentalities into being complacent for the system as a whole, which is still about massive private bankers that do what they do nonetheless, albeit maybe a little bit more controlled, but still the fundamentals are the same. And then a government and cultural system that really doesn't manifest the best in humanity. It's still kind of, materialistic and, not ideal. Whereas a public banking system that doesn't even have private bankers at all, because it's not a thing, or if it is, it's about credit unions and very ethical ones by law, very withheld. And then reinvesting very proactively in making the world a better place and solving the world's problems, like reversing all the ecosystem problems. I mean, think about what the Manhattan Project was. Okay, let me give you an example. What did we do in the Manhattan Project? We had to gather a shitload of scientists and engineers, et cetera, with an extremely big, focused effort that we put money and vision into, big time.
Oh yeah,
right. It was like life or death. Guide the resources of humanity together. Well, the Apollo mission was the same type of thing. What is that? Okay, that's what makes a nation great, and that's what makes nations memorable. We're not going to remember anything about any nation that didn't do stuff like that in the big scheme of things, right? And that's how we need to think again. Is like Apollo mission, Manhattan Project, except for creating post-scarcity. Environmental, saving the environment, and all the other big problems that we should overcome to create like a Star Trek type of society. We need to proactively create it. And so the banking system being regulated is not the system to create that Star Trek world.
No, but going back to your earlier point about the power of the pen, and if we did do things where, hey, you know what if we just made for-profit banking entities illegal? Don't need them. I mean, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, good old days. If you are not working in the interests of the American commons, you're basically getting the death penalty. You got no business here. He did dissolve corporations that were proved to be working against us. We were hardcore back then. He didn't take any shit. He's kind of the exact opposite of Trump, by the way. Speak softly and carry a big stick. This is like, wow, exact opposite. So, or force them to be public. The way they're beholden not to just the bottom line. And they aren't required by law, because a lot of people forget that a corporate entity is required by law just to make money. So even if that means like, oh, we're going to have to like poison the food because somehow this poison happens to be legal, that's going to make us more money. We have to do it. It's bizarre. So working through that, but we can take those little steps. And I think going local is a really empowering one.
Well, it's empowering because it's a fundamental unit. As you mentioned, like running into your city council member at the grocery store, the civic unit of the city is actually the most fundamental unit there is. Anything beyond the city is just networks of cities, right, or countryside. But the city is the civic unit. I mean, think about the origin of humanity was at Sumer, the first city-state. It's the fundamental, like the first of any type of civilization usually begins with a city-state by definition, and then they consolidate. So the city is the basic unit. And I think if we start to think like that again, and then people are very, very engaged with their city halls in the future, with municipal public banks, imagine, like, I think it would have like this like Renaissance type cultural explosion, like what happened in Italy. That was city-states. That was the Renaissance. Oh. What happened in the Greek Golden Age, that was city-states. I think there's something to, a city identity that creates kind of a buzz of intellectual energy.
Oh, definitely. Well, and in France, during the Catholic versus Protestant era, that was part of that consolidation of power, was the Pope and the King coming together against those city-states that were kind of doing their own thing. Really fascinating. So I can't help it, though, but it's like my Jewish paranoia gets the best of me. And I actually lived in Missouri for a couple of years when I was going to college out there. And there's definitely that vibe. And with the Bundy rebellion, isn't there some part of you that's like, whoa, maybe we shouldn't encourage these local movements too much, because it's going to turn into this like anti-federalist just wave of secessionist movements or something really dangerous like a return to the Confederacy?
I think that's a really good point, because as you can tell, I'm arguing the local thing from a left-wing perspective.
Right.
Because it's a fascinating thing, because on the one hand, it's like, okay, well, think about this. What if a state or a city has a legislation that's against certain human rights, like reversing civil rights or whatever, right? Or even the Supreme Court's ability to overturn or to overturn the gay marriage thing. And like, what if the central large authority is more enlightened than the smaller authorities?
Right.
Isn't that better as a whole, right? But then the question is what if the central authority sucks, and then and then there's other enlightened smaller authorities that are being held back? For example, if I think that if California and Los Angeles, I'm not saying like secession necessarily. I mean, who knows what the future might hold, but I'm not even a proponent of that per se. But just if hypothetically the federal government was just kind of dissolved a little bit of power, and then the power of the states increased a little bit more, right? Mm-hmm. In a way, California probably could blast past everybody in a lot of ways, and so could the other progressive ones. And so how do you decide which one is best? But one thing that makes me a little bit more prone to the localism, I guess, is because I realize this: the Bundys of the world, a lot of Trump supporter types, not to be, to stereotype, but to think of the stereotypes. A lot of the hardcore right-wing libertarian type people, they will never change their mind, and they are as passionate, if not more passionate, if possible, than we are about the way we feel. And they will fight to the death to have their system, at the end of the day, as a whole, in the scheme of things, unfolding history. So, in a way, having a whole that's connected but squabbling incessantly and completely a house divided, versus people having self-determination and doing the thing they want to do, and yet leaving open migration ability. So if somebody says, you know what, I don't like the rules in this town or city or state, let me move to that state because that fits my style more. And then having that open, maybe people can actually be happier because they can have what they want. Isn't that freedom, more of freedom? People just having what they want instead of half the people being pissed all the time? That's just another perspective to consider.
Imagine that. Well, it's kind of like, it is a paradox. For example, how I feel about the UN. It's really important that it exists. Are there some problems with it, or there's some troublemakers? Sure. But, I'm definitely glad it's there. However, I'm really glad that nations have their sovereignty. Otherwise, what would be the point of the United Nations? We need to represent, our specific cultures, and it's beautiful that we're so diverse. But you need to you need to draw the line somewhere. And it's interesting. You talk about kind of coming at it, the local issue from a left-wing point of view. I've always kind of felt that way about the immigration issue. I'm all for being strict about who we let in and who we let leave. For Christ's sake, if you owe $50,000, maybe we shouldn't just have a libertarian paradise where we just let people come and go wherever they want. Maybe I look at it more, how can we protect unions? How can we have a really stable economy? And it's not going to be just combining our nation's economy with other countries and whatnot. But it really is a fascinating paradox.
Well, people don't realize that the origin of nationalism was actually started as a left-wing concept in the French Revolution. It was the left-wingers that were the nationalists. That's fascinating, right? Because to them, because the nation represented the whole, it represented the communal, right? As opposed to like principalities being ruled by the monarch or whatever. It was like a different mentality, and so it's just fascinating the way things change, just like the way Democrats and Republicans switched historically because of its idiosyncratic reasons. So I think that there's a Wikipedia article on left-wing nationalism, and that's the idea of like a nation that acts in the common well-being of its own people and then has moral standards of equal rights and, pro-women's health and all the other positive left-wing things, but in a nationalist kind of thing. So that's just something to consider if and considering all the different ways we can do things, and there's paradoxes with all of it. How do we tease through it? We just have to really think, I guess, use our brains.
That is interesting how nationalism can kind of represent collectivism, whereas the monarchy just represents the elite. And H.G. Wells, I remember hearing a term attributed to him. Apparently he believed, because, he did coin that term when he wrote the book New World Order. Which was one of your Age of Reason episodes that I really liked. And he, that term, it's just so enduring. But apparently he was all for it, if you actually read the whole thing. And that's maybe why this seemingly contradictory term can make sense, because liberal fascism, it's like we do need like sort of that iron fist to rule. But as long as they're enlightened, as long as they're reasonable. And that's very British. Of course he was British. They're kind of like, hey, somebody's got to rule the world. It might as well be the polite fellows.
Well put, yeah.
So interesting. And it also sort of, I just had to throw this out there, but the way you were talking about the city-state sort of being this organic development, it's almost like the way, talk about as above, so below, right? And the meta of everything. It's very similar to how the human body operates. We got all these people traveling back and forth, sort of like, the roads are like arteries and veins, and you got these centralized locations, downtown or Hollywood. It's like the heart and the brain. So, it really does trip me out. Bear with me here. The segue is, it's there's something almost organic about politics, and people treat it like it's this cold, distant kind of mechanism. But more and more, they're finding democracy is natural. Schools of fish and birds, they actually vote, like telepathically. That's why they all know to change at the same time. And even a lot of more tribal species like wolves and stuff, there might be like an alpha male, alpha female, but that is usually just a sexual thing. So
just to counter that, I will say that in an animal society, sex or who owns the females is very much a sign of power, to the degree that money would be a sign of power in our society.
Oh, because it's still property.
Right. In its context, it's still like a power play.
Interesting. Right. Okay. So to a degree, for sure. But still, as far as like predatory stuff, animals eat to survive. Maybe cats will kind of fuck around with the mouse or torture that lizard a little bit too much, before it eats it, or it won't even eat it. It'll just like leave it as a present. But there's something really unnatural about the way we do things. People can feel it. People feel like their vote doesn't count. That's why they seem like they're disgusted with the whole system. Yet,
well, keep in mind, when democracy was invented, it was invented in a city-state, right? And so what would happen, the way that they did it actually is, now, granted, the majority of people in Athens were not citizens, and many of them were slaves, and then women couldn't vote, and then a lot of men couldn't vote either unless they were born in Athens. So it was kind of like an elite, but it was like a wide elite, right? It was like a wide elite is the way to look at it. But they were voted upon nonetheless. And they would meet in like the city hall, and then they would have these, oratory, periods where they would discuss everything, and then they'd all have put in their vote, and it was like this big civic engagement that all the citizens came together, right? So democracy on a city level is just way more tenable than this. What we have is not, whatever this is. What it is it's an oligarchy that kind of like plays democracy to make us feel good. but it's not. I think there's going to be a radical shift in the system overhaul at some point, and people are losing faith in this fraud of the system in which corporatists are the only guarantee. That's not democracy.
Right. Okay, so then maybe we can find a middle ground. It's definitely not working the way things are. And yeah, for my money, the United States was never supposed to be this big. Even the British warned us about fucking around with the Native Americans because they had a lot of experience that themselves. They didn't want to lose control of the colonies. They wanted a really tight, highly controlled area. And of course, it's our founding fathers who are like, boo-boo, we're going to expand our property. We're going to do whatever the hell we want. So that's a interesting thing. We act like it's just like, ooh, white people versus the natives or whatever. But Britain definitely knew not to expand. So, sorry, where was I going with that? Yeah, and so we're just so expansive now. Puerto Rico and all this stuff. Like, there's a lot of confusion, and it seems like we're never going to stop expanding. So if you're not for straight up secession, what about something like the 9 nations of the United States? People have drawn up, you can see maps online. Like break it up into like 9 big municipalities.
I don't think that needs to happen by fiat. I don't think that's some like big government advisory council needs to come together and say, I shall declare. I think what's going to happen is like just as a par course of history, it's just going to unfold this way, where you're going to have, people kind of opting for their sovereignty in whatever ways that they kind of create organically. And it's really hard to predict that, but it probably will fall roughly along those lines naturally, more or less. If I had to predict like the way America will unfold in the scheme of history, like it might go like the Roman Empire, where it kind of like balkanizes and loses control of certain regions. That might happen because there's such a big anti-government, like right-wing kind of militia mindset in this country, unlike any other country in the world. So it's like ungovernable in the scheme of things. So I think it's just going to be kind of a natural thing. I can't predict, but it's fun to play futurism.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Anything could happen, and I'm certainly grateful to be living in such interesting times. So what do you think? Obviously, we are at this tipping point what do you think the new economy is going to look like?
Yeah.
Are there some things? I mean, we talked about banking and whatnot, but anything else like worker-owned co-ops or?
Big time. So I think that the nature of capitalism needs to fundamentally shift, right? I don't think that the answer is kind of like old Cold War style Soviet nationalization of everything. It's not that type of thing. But I think that the way markets are conducted should all be done for the common good. So definitely more co-ops. Those types of business organizations need to be stimulated and incentivized. I think that one thing is moral hazard of corporations acting as people, which by definition kind of turns people into psychopaths, because like you're running a corporation, but it's a separate entity. So you have this moral hazard, and then you're able to take big risks that you wouldn't take if it was your own liability. So I think ending corporate personhood and just making businesses should basically sole proprietorships or partnerships, basically.
Sure. I mean, they can't be treated like people because corporations never die. People die,
and they don't have consciences, and they're acted upon on behalf of other people who are one step removed from the decision. So they're going to A, act reckless, B, act immorally. It's crazy talk. Mm-hmm. So that's good. That right there will scale back boom bust cycles, because people are going to take much less risky investments. Then outlawing speculation, derivative trading, shorting, all the credit default swaps, all these types of things. Done, outlawed, right? And that's not infringing on freedom, like some people might think when they hear the word outlawed. It's not infringing on freedom. It's doing the exact opposite. It's creating the freedom to have a more enlightened economy, which makes the living conditions of the average person much better, and that is true freedom.
Sure.
In a better society. So ending speculation, ending corporate personhood. A New Deal type implementation or the New Deal policies. So, building 100% green energy grids, possibly desalination plants. Whatever you can think of that can solve the big problems and put a lot of people to work. This is the type of way that I think we need to be thinking about the future, as this proactive. Making imminent of the post-scarcity Star Trek world, not just waiting to happen organically, but consciously manifesting it.
I love it. I was talking about the New Deal with someone and brought up the 91% tax rate. And, people, they're just so ADD, and you kind of do have to just boil things down to a sound clip type essence. But it just sounds so insane to them. And, by the time you're done explaining some other story about Alex Jones, how FDR sold us to the Chinese, that's already made its way around the world. What did Mark Twain say? Like, the falsehood is going to make its way around the world twice by the time the truth is just tying its shoes. It's really bizarre. But, yeah, basically I was going to say tax reforms. Because what people don't understand is that 91% tax rate, it wasn't just like straight up, like everybody who makes money, for every dollar you make. No, it was like only after you already made $1 million. So, I mean, I don't know how much of that $1 million you get to keep, but in fact, Jello Biafra, he was on, of the Dead Kennedys, he was on the Bill Maher show back in the 90s. And I remember being this teenage punk rocker, so excited, Jello Biafra is going to be on. And he brought up something I'd never, ever heard of, a maximum wage.
Right.
And how nobody needs $1 billion. And I know it sounds like socialism to a lot of people, but this is what the founders wanted, because the original wage laws in this country were not minimum wage laws. They were maximum wage laws, because that's how we paid, since there was no income tax at the time. That's how we paid for the White House. That's how we paid for this country, was through those kinds of taxes and barriers and tariffs. And I mean, another way I'll put it is that if you have a company, let's say, I mean, of course, living the way things are, the predatory way, You're just going to stash as much money as you can in your offshore Cayman Island tax haven or your Swiss bank account, whereas the New Deal way would be, hey, you have to reinvest it into the company because you're incentivized through these tax things to keep the money. You don't want to make more than $1 million profit, perhaps. So you give people bonuses and stuff, and then they generate. It's like a direct injection into the economy. And again, I mean, we just need to work on getting the message out that these are not like socialist plots. These are ways to keep the system healthy. It's like a tree.
It's enlightened capitalism. It's social capitalism.
Right. Social capitalism. I like it.
Right. That's what it is. And here's another thing. Here's the one tax that can change the world in an extremely, extremely significant way is the inheritance tax. Okay, that's big because that transfers massive wealth from one generation to the other, right? So imagine somebody's worth like $65 billion, right, and then an heir to that fortune. Literally, you will have a dynasty of people who can then influence policy, and because money can grow at that level, it'll grow over time. What we're witnessing without this inheritance tax law is the manifestation of a neo-aristocracy, right? And if we think about the Rothschilds, anybody that's like quote unquote woken up on the internet knows about the Rothschild conspiracy or like all these bankers out there.
We're on to you, Red Shield.
Here's the fact. Well, let's just give an example. If you had an inheritance tax where you could not inherit more than $10 million, all right? Let's just say that. Okay? Think about this. The people that inherit $10 million is already less than 1% of people. So you're basically effectively almost nobody except for a very small percentage of people. However, the thing is wealth exponentially grows. It's not about 1 versus 99. That's a convenient thing. Mm-hmm. But I don't have a problem with people in the 1 per se. It's the 0.01 or 0.001. That's really what we're talking, right? So if hypothetically somebody had $65 billion and then they died and then their son inherited $10 million, which was the maximum inheritance, that could go towards reinvesting in the common good for whatever way that it could go. There are a million ways. But instead of creating an oligarchy, this person would still be fairly well off, almost more than anybody. But then you prevent an oligarchy from existing. And imagine if you had 100% inheritance tax over a certain point. Then you literally, in one generation, almost click the reboot button on society, and then everything gets reinvested fresh. And that in tandem with all the laws you talked about to keep the money in the country and reinvest in bonuses, that is a very pro-social economy. I think that would be revolutionary. You'd never have an oligarchy again.
Sure. And I remember, who was it? Bill Gates? They were like withholding money from their kids just because they wanted them to get some life experience. Necessity is the mother of invention, and you're going to get a lot more creative and innovative if you get out there and you actually have to struggle, have to figure things out like the rest of us.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, Jimmy Carter himself, I believe it was on the Thom Hartmann program a few years ago, he declared this nation no longer a constitutional republic, but a oligarchy. And it's for those reasons exactly. So, yeah, it's time to take the power back. I mean, because how much further do they need to take it? Again, nobody needs over $1 billion. And how is it going to feel to be a rich man in a poor country? I mean, you can hide in your gated community, but eventually, I mean, you're not going to be able to eat money. If you treat people like shit and the environment like shit, you're going to have nothing to eat eventually.
Keep this in mind, right? Think about the elite. I mean, imagine if you're in this really old family that goes back many generations that's extremely well connected, right? And you go to the top private schools. You traveled around with your parents, maybe meeting presidents and the Pope and shit like that, right?
Well, yeah.
The Queen of England, like that's the life you live. And and you're worth billions of dollars and whatever, right? And everybody kisses your ass because of your name. The only working class people that person ever freaking grew up with are literally like the help, okay? And that rest is like this bubble for the most part. So that psychologically, literally creates it's a mindset where I don't even think they could empathize if they wanted to, or at least not all of them. That's a stereotype. I'm not a stereotyper, but I think as a general trend, that's the type of mentality that actually manifests in this elite. And so when people are thinking about like creating revolutionary change, it's not going to be love and light, because they don't like look at us as, I think they look at us as like ants, to be honest, like the masses, the fodder. And we have to realize like it's a mind war, and people have to wake up that we can't be handed the world we want by the status quo that has given us the world that we have. We have to wrestle the levers of power, and this is why, yelling like "Occupy" in the street can only go so far, and is only effective if it is a strategy in tandem with affecting the levers of power through legislation.
Sure. And I'm with you. I don't really like the term 99% or 1%, because we are part of the whole. It's 100% or nothing. And everybody's different. This is why, when people are just like, definite Illuminati, it's like, have you ever met more than one family member? They never get along on everything. People disagree. People change their minds all the time. And even wealth, you're right, they're not all the same. Look at the Roosevelts. They were seen as traitors to the aristocratic class because of all these things that they were doing for the commons, and the Kennedys too, to a degree.
Kennedys, I was going to say that, yeah.
Right, whereas Ronald Reagan came from nothing and wound up just decimating the middle class. So you never know.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are. It's not that it's a conscious predatory thing. They're just playing the hand that they were dealt. And remember, that kid even got off of a murder case or manslaughter case because they decided he had affluenza. It's like he didn't even know any better. And I feel like it was that George Bush Jr. generation where their parents weren't even around. Just industriousness was such a big deal to their parents' generation that they kind of grew up, like you said, not only in that bubble, but with no one really there to instill a sense of right from wrong. So It is going to take a while, but
there's a quote that I liked. I forgot who said it, but it was like, if you're poor and you're a psychopath, you rob the bank, right? Or you'll murder or whatever. But if you're rich and you're a psychopath, then you can run the bank.
Right. Or like a fool robs the bank, but like a true criminal owns the bank.
Right. All of humanity is the same. And so I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to this, is like any society in which one class of people has a privileged, dominant position over the rest, I think that's an inherent evil. And any society that sees everybody as equal under the law with equal opportunity is the right type of society, right? And yes, overthrowing monarchies and creating republics was a huge step forward for humanity, right? Like there's tragedies in history, like the Library of Alexandria and like other things where like, oh, that sucks that happened. But then there's other things I'm like, oh, that's really awesome that happened. Like, the revolutions and the Enlightenment that led to these anti-monarchy movements, right? But what's happened is the power that represents monarchy, the power that represents a very tiny elite living in a completely separate universe from the masses, that's happening now with 85 people owning half the wealth of the world. I mean, it's there. We're there. And it's only getting worse. So at a certain point, there's going to have to be a paradigm shift where the assets of these people are seized from overseas, where there might be some massive level of debt forgiveness, where there's going to have to be new governments. I think that there's going to be a tumultuous breakdown of the order in the next few years, within the next 10 at most, I think. And we're going to start to see these revolutionary type movements, I think far right and far left, emerging. And it's going to be very interesting times ahead.
Well, that's why I'm calling this the Populist Papers. I decided progressive is still a term that's really divisive. People have told me like, oh, you're progressive, so you must like being managed by others, like elites or something. It's just so weird. So I figure like, hey, looking at the rise of Bernie and even Trump, there is this wave of populism happening. People are finally thinking about like, oh, how does this affect the majority of us? And,
Yeah.
I think people are starting to see more in that direction, and it's happening, this paradigm shift. So, but absolutely, that kind of wealth, I mean, it only leads to more wealth addiction and more of that us versus them kind of separation. And it seems like it's a form of psychosis. So do you think that when this shift finally takes hold, are we going to move into a new eon of like reasoned cooperation, or are the fucking bastards, are they going to have their goons just unleash total chaos in one
So-
last death coup to like maintain?
Here's what I think, to be quite honest, is that the future has not happened. History is yet to be written, and both are technically possibilities depending on what the hell people do. Literally. I think that, see, the reason why, I'm just trying to organize my thoughts here. There's so many things that go into my mind, but the reason why this question of like this dominating elite over the masses is so pertinent is because I'm going to give an example. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of the singularity, transhumanism, the idea of genetic engineering.
I played Deus Ex.
I actually didn't. I have heard that. I was just interested in this separately, but
like Homo evolutus, all that stuff.
Right. So, but I will say this: that if we get to a point where these technologies become ubiquitous, and we are still in a paradigm of extreme haves and have-nots, then the extreme haves will, I think, have the ability to like evolve themselves into a dominating species that's superior to the masses, right? If they can only afford it.
Wow.
If these types of technologies become part of the commonwealth, then it could be extremely beneficial for society. So we can't just wait for technology to help us, and we can't just like let things be, because letting things be is the status quo, and that will lead to dystopia. So apathy is pro-dystopia, I think, in the scheme of things. And that's really what drives me to realize, like, holy crap, the human race is at stake here, because we're dealing with psychopaths and antisocial people that actually are going to lead to a very bad situation. And we have to create enlightened governance. We have to create an enlightened culture, or we're screwed. And the alternative is, or everything will be freaking amazing too. Imagine, a Star Trek Zeitgeist future, with post-scarcity. That'd be awesome. We have to fight for that.
Right. Well, it comes down to us getting the message out and creating a model. So maybe that's where local movements do come into play, is remember Canada's national healthcare program started in Saskatchewan by, I believe, Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather. And I think Trump is a big 24 fan. So if somebody could just get Kiefer to sit his ass down and be like, dude, guess what? My grandfather is the most beloved human being in Canadian history, which he is. Tommy Douglas, I believe, because he gave Saskatchewan and subsequently all of Canada their national healthcare system. So if we try things out, I know single payer is on the table right now in California. So,
exactly. That's that. And you know what? Even Obamacare started as Omnicare in Massachusetts.
Right.
I mean, it's the whole laboratory. And I think that was part of what the founding fathers actually kind of were designing purposely, was like these laboratories of democracy, as it's been called, retrospectively.
Well, and you called real quick earlier, I think you kind of called like the Democratic Party sort of center-right, and Obamacare is a perfect example, because the more progressive solution would have been single-payer or universal coverage. And it was actually the Heritage Foundation, a lot of people don't know this, that first formulated the Affordable Care Act. And Nixon was even down with it. But I think Ted Kennedy at the time, he was going to hold out for a public option, and I think Lieberman fought it as well. But just imagine if we had had the equivalent of Obamacare back during Nixon, how much further along we'd be now. So that's why I tend to be a fan of, moderation and compromise, because it's a hell of a lot better than having nothing.
I think that that era of the 20th century leading into now was a specific era of the height of the U.S. and the winning of the West, right? Because World War II could have ended with a fascist paradigm, quite literally, and After that, we could have ended up in a harsh communist dictatorship type paradigm. But we happen to be in the paradigm of liberal democracy that we've taken for granted. So in the 90s, a book came out called The End of History. This guy, Francis Fukuyama, wrote a thesis basically saying that all the economic and government systems of the world have officially been tried, and now history is finally over. And now the whole rest of the world, from the early 90s to infinity, will be liberal Western democracy with a capitalist system. He's like, that's it. It's done. And now it's starting to look, if you really see what's going on around the world, that Fukuyama is probably proven wrong. The rise of extremism will rise as liberalism starts to fail big time, and you start to see rising nationalist, populist movements. Possible economic crisis and collapse going forward, which will only exacerbate the matter. Racial issues are reemerging. That could lead to more social cohesion of coming apart. So we have to look at what the other possible alternatives going forward will be demanded. And I think you're going to see fascists start fighting again. You're going to see communists and fascists fighting. And you're already starting to see hints of that. These Berkeley Antifa versus Trump supporter fights, it's like you're starting to see the seeds of this type of environment and the collapse of the world order around us. And I think it's only the embers in the beginning, it's not even the spark. I think that we're going to see very interesting times ahead. That out of chaos rises order. And I think that from that, if the enlightened of us are willing to fight as hard as the racists and the apologists for the elite are willing to fight for their side, then we can come out victorious. But it's not going to be kumbaya. I really don't believe so. We have a real revolution on our hands.
Definitely. We're in it for the long haul. Interesting stuff. Yeah, certainly such a rise of extremism on both sides. It's a little bit terrifying. Right. Definitely makes me kind of miss for the good old days of like Bill Clinton and Bob Dole shaking hands on the debate stage. And now it's like, you're going to jail if I win.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was very telling. I mean, it's a paradigm shift. But you know what? Here's the thing: is I'm not pessimistic actually, right? Because the system itself and its mediocrity was due for an overhaul. We weren't the system that Bill Clinton and Bob Dole resided over wasn't going to ever take us to the post-scarcity, zeitgeist Star Trek type world itself.
No, it was the status quo.
Right? It was never going to do that. It was always just going to stupefy the masses and enrich the elites ad infinitum. The thing is the way history unfolds is every dog has its day, and you have rises and falls of empires and rises and falls of them. You have the masses that grow angry as the elite hubris becomes unbearable. I mean, this is just the way history unfolds. So I think we need a breakdown of our comfort level, because the comfort level in the center-right policies, as opposed to the far-right policies that were perceived as left-wing policies that placated the left, that was an intravenous sedative. It was a drug that kept us stupefied and willing to be happy for Obamacare and happy for a little minimum wage increase. It's like, no, you're not thinking big enough. Let's freaking create a new system and actually manifest a new reality that is really ideal. And it's not a pipe dream to do this, because we have the technology, we have the theory, we have the vision. If we can just organize people to see it together, and all we have to do is have the will and just manifest it, and it'll be shocking the amount that I think that humans can accomplish within a few decades if they think like this.
Yeah, that unrealized potential. I think that there is something to be said for change by degree, gradual change rather than radical change. But that's a whole nother can of worms. And, I think this is really interesting, the whole Phoenix theme. Because, well, my understanding is, you're talking about it's kind of the end of an era. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically like every 500 years, it's basically this new dawning. The egg hatches open, and it's this civilization gets this reboot. So like with ancient Greece, and then the Roman Empire, the birth of Christianity, the rise of Islam, and then the Renaissance. So it feels like, we're right there, kind of overdue for something new. So, I mean, what do you think the new eon looks like?
Well, I'll put out another interesting one I learned about, just to preface it too. In the year 1200 BC, you had like the world order of like the Egyptians, the Hittites, that world in the Mediterranean, and that all collapsed, and everybody went into the dark ages in that world, and they lost literacy, population decreased significantly, cities were abandoned, trade grinded to a halt, and it was the dark ages for a few hundred years. What emerged from that? The Greek Golden Age. As you mentioned, the Renaissance emerged from the Dark Ages. So, yes, that's the Phoenix effect. And I think that when this next breakdown occurs, you're going to have some hard times, and you're going to have some evil people do evil things, and you're going to have some incredible people do amazing things. And I would like to have, hopefully, faith in the latter, that they can pull it off, and all of us together can really manifest that vision. But I think it's going to look like you're gonna have probably a more local system. You're gonna have a very proactive type of mindset rather than reactive, that actually has vision of where we want to be in 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years, and proactively manifest scientific solutions. I think a culture of science, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, and over superstition is also another really important one too. That's another big obstacle that's holding us back. So, cultural rationality, an economic system that invests in every person, an education system that basically turns every child into a genius. I think that's technically possible with the right machinations, right? Why do some parents raise geniuses? It's because I guess they, besides the genetic stuff, I think everybody has an incredible amount of potential that's not manifested in our current education system. So making a new education system, giving everybody access to that. If you hired the finest minds in teaching and pedagogy and child psychology, and you said, hey, create an education system to create the perfect person, and then you applied that school by school by school, almost like a Manhattan Project for the mind, right?
Sure.
Or an Apollo mission for the mind, right? Like a total education reboot, total banking and finance reboot. A new deal to create like 3D printing plants that can create a new industrial revolution, so we can produce stuff, and then the income from that goes towards paying for basic income, right?
Yeah.
You can just imagine this golden age we can create with like a 21st century fix. 100% green energy as well. No more fossil fuel use. That type of stuff.
Sure. Well, I mean, I feel like now I need to do an entire show just on rebooting the educational system. It's just because I am a teacher, and it's so horrifying sometimes seeing one kid who might be like treated like a dummy because he didn't get this one thing. And
right.
Yet, who knows how gifted he could be if he had access to a drum kit. He could be one of the world's greatest percussionists, but he'll never even have access to it. And it's like people of our grandparents' generation, they got to learn how to play the piano in public school. It is so bizarre to me, but I think people are getting it, and this is our revolution. And this takes us back to the very beginning of the conversation. You were talking about just this exponential momentum, and whatever this movement is, also on a micro level, the Phoenix effect kind of works with evolution. I mean, we went through the nomadic age, which brought us into the agricultural era, and then into the industrial age. And you look at how we're going exponentially down, like bottleneck evolution. It's like it took tens of thousands of nomadic years just to get to those thousands of agricultural years. Then it's only hundreds of industrial years before, I guess now we're in the age of communications. And it only took decades, to get to this point.
And that's singularity right now. So at some point in decades from now, we're going to reach a critical threshold with AI, and then we better damn well have enlightened governance, because if we don't, then the wrong people will be in charge of that extremely powerful technology, and that's very worrisome.
Right. When everyone was talking about 2012, it's like time for change. Well, I mean, I just thought I had to move, which I did, and it felt great. It's like time for change. Something is happening. But really, I asked a really good friend of mine who's Mayan, and he was like, well, first of all, clock's wrong. Your guys' clock is all wrong, which is like, that's a whole nother thing, kind of phantom time hypothesis, Gregorian calendar errors. But his point was, really, it's just a suggestion. If you guys don't get your act together by this point, then you're done for. And you talk about this enlightened form of governance, and I think that was it. They may have been very small victories that specific year, 2012, but definitely we did see the majority of people change. It's like, oh yeah, gay marriage. The majority of people are finally cool with that in this country. So whatever this next thing is, yeah, it's going to be a total paradigm shift.
Good call. So I want to point out another thing. Isn't it crazy that, like, in the 50s, if you just went around, people would just throw around the N-word casually, actually around here. It's just literally how it was. And then decades later, that's, like, unthinkable. Like, yeah, there's subtle racism and there's racism emerging in other ways, but this blatant systematic racism where you could literally not let somebody into a restaurant and then lynch them in the open, and then within one generation, that's unthinkable. In England, you have the king an entirely Catholic nation, because the king wanted to get a divorce. Within 2 generations, the whole country was not only Protestant, but like having inquisitions against the Catholics practically. Right? So it's incredible. So the fact is like the average person, I think what you have is you have like the people that create the culture, you have people that input into the culture and into the mindset, and people that have power. And then you have like the average person, and I think that like literally you have like this battle of the memes. You have this battle of culture and what people are thinking about in the media, whatever. And there's people fighting for pro-social and anti-social things, pro-elite and pro-people things. And if the people can get convinced on a subject, and then a fire sparks, boom, they're all on top of it. Like Standing Rock is a great example. All of a sudden, it started from this indigenous resistance, and now people of all races across the entire nation are seeing Standing Rock as a symbol for resistance against the system. And all of a sudden, like, this meme blows up in people's collective consciousness, and it's incredible how that works.
Yeah, the ripple effect. I couldn't believe it last night when Amy Goodman was saying that Obama didn't even know about the dogs attacking people at Standing Rock when she was issued a warrant for inciting a riot. But, people caught that footage on their phones, thankfully. Yeah. And it was a young woman from Malaysia. And Barack Obama first found out about the dogs while he was in Laos. And it's just, that's people power, And, of course, the issue was not lost on him. Our first African-American president, he did put an end to it. He ordered the easement, I believe. So, right. Boy, I wish we still had him.
So I would like that type of enthusiasm now, because people are saying screw Trump. People are saying we need a system change and whatever, or they're focused on identity politics, whatever. But I will say that if we want to have a really effective movement, let's all get behind this public banking push. Hashtag the public banking movement. Add the stuff on Facebook and get on board with that. And then maybe make content for public banking, because I truly believe that this one thing is extremely clutch. It's going to move a lot of money out of Wall Street into local communities. And our vision down the line is, yeah, we're attacking the banking now, but you know what? Once we start to get the hang of what we're doing here as an activist organization affecting City Hall, we want to get people into City Hall. We want. Once we have that, it'll be a lot easier to push legislation, and we want to keep on writing legislation that's enlightened and get it through City Hall. And that's the model we want everybody across the whole nation and their cities to do: write legislation, get it through City Hall, create a movement, get people in City Hall, and you'll be amazed at how much you can do. And from there, we can change education, green energy, and all the other pillars that we need to attack after banking.
Yeah. Hashtag public banking. All right. So what's next for you, and how can listeners stay in the loop?
All right. Well, what's next for us is right now we're getting this divestment movement passed. Right now, I recommend everybody joins Divest LA to get on top of that. And if you're in another city, not only join that, but create your own if you can, or get on board with a local divestment movement. Get on board with a public banking option. See if there's anybody that's an activist for public banking, or just start to spread that word. If you're in the Los Angeles area, if you check out revolutionla.com or revolutionla.org or divestla.com, there's a full breakdown of what we're doing and who we are. And my email is phoenixgoodman1@gmail.com, and my YouTube channel is Age of Reason on YouTube.
Excellent. revolutionla.org and divestla.com. Check it out. So, Phoenix, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. This has been really interesting, and I'd love to have you on again in the future.
I know that as well. It's always interesting talking to you on and off air.
All right. All right. Well, take care, and we'll definitely be in touch.
All right, cool. Have a good one, dude.
You too. Thanks again.